This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 966 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. It's been a minute since I did one of these episodes. You may have heard Rich Ryan and me talk best ball with our Becoming a Best Ball Bro recap about a week and a half ago. But this, the Late Round Podcast, it's been a minute. I've missed you guys. Now, over the last few weeks, I've been getting Late Round Fantasy Football's new COO, David Kitchen, up to speed. And I've also been in my prospecting cave. The ZAP model, it's updated, it's better than ever. And I can't wait to get to all that prospecting work over the next couple of months. Now, usually my first episode after a long season is all about the things that I got wrong. It's about me refining my process to make sure that I don't make the same mistakes year after year. And trust me, I'll get to that episode. In fact, there won't be a mailbag episode or a late round perspectives episode on Friday this week. Instead, you're going to get that episode. And I'll follow it up with an episode on the things that went right. And that's for early next week. Remember, during the off season, you get 2 episodes of the show each week. One kind of a fresh episode each Tuesday, and then one mailbag or perspectives episode on Friday. Except for this week. Now, regardless of all that admin stuff, today I want to talk about something that I brought up a ton of times on the show throughout the season. I thought to myself, you know what? The people need a research study after my brief hiatus. Actually, that's not even true. I'm kind of creating this episode for selfish reasons. A lot of my work is driven by just pure curiosity. When something strange is happening in fantasy football, I want to dig into that something and learn more about it. And that brings me to the topic today, running backs, specifically running backs during the 2024 fantasy season. Because there's some weird stuff that went on with the position this year, and I want to get to the bottom of it. Now, before getting to the research, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Underdog is the easiest and best place to play fantasy sports. And with the conference championships happening this weekend, there are plenty of contests to choose from to get in on the action. You can do snake drafts, and there's always pick'em selections out there too. Check it all out at underdogfantasy.com, and if you're new to the site, sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit offer. I also wanted to let you know that the Late Round Prospect Guide is officially available for pre-order. This is year number 4 for the Prospect Guide, and it's back and better than ever. Like I said earlier, over the last couple of weeks, I've been fine-tuning the ZAP models, and I've made a couple of enhancements that makes the models more predictive. But in the guide, you'll see what those enhancements are. You'll get a rundown of what's in the models. You get profiles of every running back and wide receiver who will be at the NFL Combine. You get tight end ZAP scores after the draft. You get profiles for the year 2 model, and more. Right now, you can pre-order it for $14.99 by heading to lateround.com and clicking Guides. Once the guide launches in March, that price is going to go up to $19.99. So you can save money by ordering right now. Check it all out, lateround.com. Now, I'm assuming all of you played fantasy football in 2024. And if you did, you may have noticed that things were a little bit different at running back. Running backs just seem to be better. Saquon Barkley was a monster. Derrick Henry did his thing. Bijan Robinson was a beast. Josh Jacobs seemed to never not score a touchdown. And honestly, the same goes for James Cook. Throughout the year, I kept thinking to myself, man, this is a bizarre year for running backs. In my gut, it was an outlier season. They were performing abnormally well. So it's finally time to dig into the data. My goal here was to simply ask the following question. Was the 2024 season different at running back than previous seasons that we've seen? Now, there are plenty of ways to dissect that question, and I plan on looking at a few angles on today's show. First, let's just look at the results. One way to see if the running back position scored more or scored better is by looking at how many fantasy points the position actually scored, like in total. And at that super high level, nothing was really funky with running backs this year. When compared to the last 5 seasons, running backs across the league scored their second lowest overall total of PPR points. The 2023 season was the only one that was worse. But that doesn't really tell us that much, because that includes every running back across the league. What I'm more concerned about is the top running backs, the ones who impact fantasy football. So let's look at this in a different way. I looked at every year since 2014, And 2014 seems arbitrary, but it represents how far back the average draft position data goes from fantasydata.com. And I'll be digging into ADP in a little bit. But I looked at every season since 2014, and I charted the top running backs by PPR point per game finish. So the RB1 in 2014, for example, he scored 23.2 PPR points per game. In 2015, it was 21.1 points per game. This past year, 2024, it was 22.2 PPR points per game. That was Saquon Barkley. Now, I did this all the way until RB20. That's also an arbitrary stopping point. I stopped there because I'm just doing a quick check to see if top running backs this year scored more or less points compared to previous seasons. I then took the average for each positional slot from 2014 to 2023. So RB1s, the top running backs from 2014 to 2023, they averaged 24.7 PPR points per game. Saquon Barkley this season, as I said, scored 22.2 PPR points per game. So he played 2.5 points below the average. And that was actually kind of a common theme among our top 6, top 7 running backs this year. Compared to recent history, 5 of the top 7 running backs actually played below the typical running back in that positional slot. For example, RB3s since 2014 averaged 20.5 PPR points per game. That was 0.4 points per game higher than this year's RB3, who is Bijan Robinson. And for the record, I'm using a minimum threshold of 8 games played to allow a player to be ranked here. So top 7 running backs this year kind of played below what we normally see. It wasn't far below, but it was below. But then something happens. When you get to the RB8 this season, who is Josh Jacobs, you see that he scored 17.2 PPR points per game. That was above the average from 2014 to 2023 for RB8s. And guess what? It's that way for literally every single running back up through RB20. Every single one of them outperformed what we've seen historically from their running back slot. And it wasn't by some small margin. We're talking 1.5 to 2 and sometimes more than 3 PPR points per game in a single running back slot. The results this season showed us that running backs were indeed generally better, at least the ones that we care about in fantasy football. Things started to normalize after RB20, after the 20th ranked running back in PPR points per game, but that's 20 running backs. In a 10-team league, that represents every running back starter. So if you played fantasy football this year and running backs just felt better, maybe a little bit deeper, it's because the ones that we cared about in fantasy football for the most part were better. The higher end guys weren't giving you quite the same edge as we've seen before. But we had this huge boost in production when we entered lower end RB1 range. Wide receivers were weaker, and I can get to that on a different episode this offseason. But running backs were definitely better. Of course, that's not where we should stop with this analysis. I mean, we could. We could just say, hey, running backs performed better this year, especially after the top 3 or so. But what does that mean for future seasons? Does that actually teach us anything? After seeing that running backs were performing better at sort of this individual level this year, I wanted to dig in and see if there was any reason why. I started by looking at league-wide trends. Now, if you're on any social media platform, or if you just do a quick Google search, you'll see a lot of stories about how everything's turned around for running backs. That they went from being a devalued position to now being valued. That 2024 was the year of the running back. But I don't think that's totally correct. It's not totally wrong, but it's definitely not that simple. Some teams are definitely using their running backs more to their advantage. During the regular season, we saw the Eagles go with a super run-heavy approach with Saquon Barkley. The Packers did the same thing with Josh Jacobs. The Ravens leaned heavily on Derrick Henry. But I think the fact that our biggest examples of this came from teams who signed a free agent running back, that's going to drive home a narrative that isn't necessarily totally true and factual. Let's just look at some cumulative stats to drive this point home. League-wide in 2024, running backs rushed for like 3,000 more yards than they did in 2023. But they actually rushed for fewer yards this year than what we saw in 2022. They had a better yards per carry average year over year, but again, it wasn't quite as high as 2022. And 2020 had it beat as well. And teams really weren't using running backs anymore across the league. The usage wasn't up in total. Running backs accounted for about 80 to 81% of all rushes in the NFL this past regular season. That was almost identical to what we've seen over the last 5 years. All the while, running backs weren't targeted at a higher rate through the air. In fact, running back target share in 2024, it was at a low since at least 2011. That number's been decreasing over the last 8 or so years after it peaked in 2017. So running backs weren't really getting more yards. They weren't seeing more volume on the ground. And they weren't seeing more volume through the air either, at least league-wide. Where things were a little bit different was with touchdowns. In 2024, roughly 39% of all touchdowns scored across the league came via the ground. That's offensive touchdowns. That number's definitely a lot higher than what we'd see back in like the mid-2010s. Back then, that number would drop close to 30% at times. 39% is a pretty big jump. But it's not that much different than what we've seen since 2020. And 2020 is about the time where we saw a nice uptick across the NFL in quarterback mobility. One thing that should be noted here, though, is that about 75% of the rushing touchdowns this year came via running backs. That was an almost 5 percentage point jump from 2023, and it tied a 5-year high. So when you combine these two facts, you do get something interesting. If you look at total touchdowns across the league, and you look at the proportion of those touchdowns that went to running backs on the ground, that number was the second highest that we've seen over the last 14 years in the NFL. To phrase that another way, a high proportion of touchdowns in 2024, they were being scored by running backs specifically on the ground. So let me just explain where we're at right now. Number one, in general, the most relevant running backs in fantasy football this past year, they did score a lot of points, especially in that low-end RB1 range and into that high-end RB2 bucket. But league-wide trends don't point to this being strictly due to volume. Teams didn't use running backs more than usual. Those trends do point, though, to it maybe being touchdown related. So because of that, I want to look back at the individual top 20 running backs and see if touchdowns were indeed a driving force in the better point per game numbers. And because I try not to waste your time with this podcast, they were. Touchdowns were a huge reason we saw what we saw this year. When it comes to the top 20 running backs by PPR points per game, the average one of those backs in 2024 scored about 10.5 rushing touchdowns. Not only was that the highest mark that we've seen since 2014, it was the highest mark by nearly 2 full touchdowns. Did that happen because top 20 backs saw more volume this year? I mean, they did see higher running back rush shares compared to previous seasons, but it wasn't an outlier amount. It wasn't like the touchdowns. They averaged about a 70% running back rush share per game rate, meaning any top 20 running back handled about 70% of their team's running back rushes this past year. That was the second highest number that we've seen since 2014. But we had many seasons that were within 1 percentage point of that number. So these top 20 running backs, even though league-wide running backs weren't fed more, top 20 running backs, they were fed a little bit more. But they ended up converting on a whole lot of their carries. Why did that happen? To me, there are 2 main reasons. One of them is that teams were providing more of those opportunities this year. A very real trend that we've seen in the NFL over the last 10 years is a decrease in pass rate at the goal line. Teams are running the ball more when they get close to their opponent's end zone. To give you an idea of what I mean, back in 2014, almost 49% of pass and rush attempts at the goal line, so within the opponent's 5-yard line, almost 49% of those plays were passes. That number has dropped all the way to just 41.6% in 2024. It was 41.9% in 2023 and 42.8% in 2022. Obviously, if teams are going to run the ball more at the goal line, there may be more opportunities for these running backs to get touchdowns. Now you may be thinking, but JJ, this also coincides with quarterbacks getting more rush attempts themselves. And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I don't think the increase in touchdowns that we saw from top 20 running backs this year, basically the main reason that top running backs were so different in 2024, I don't think it has everything to do with how teams run plays at the goal line. That's just a piece of the puzzle. Arguably a bigger piece was player quality. Now hear me out. Where we're at right now is that top 20 running backs scored more points this year than normal. And it really had almost everything to do with touchdowns. Or that was at least a huge driving force. Why they scored more touchdowns is the question. Team philosophy close to the goal line has played some role. but so did player health. Now let's go back to the exercise where I looked at 2024 finishes and compared them to the finishes from the previous 10 seasons. You know, where Saquon Barkley played a little bit below the norm and where the RB8 to the RB20 played well above it, consistently, like every single running back slot. One thing that's definitely apparent about those finishes is that so many of them came from running backs who were selected high in fantasy drafts this year. 15 of the top 20 running backs by PPR points per game were actually drafted in the top 20 according to Fantasy Data's ADP. That tied the highest mark that we've seen since 2014. Meanwhile, when looking at top 24 running backs by ADP this year, so RB1s and RB2s, 20 of the 24 ended up playing at least 12 games. That tied the highest rate since 2014. And those same 20 players, all of them ended up playing at least 14 games. That was the highest mark that we've seen since 2014. Let's just think about this almost philosophically for a second. What do big touchdown scorers likely have in common? They're probably decent players. They're probably quality running backs. Just this year, none of the players with high rushing touchdown totals were total surprises aside from probably Chuba Hubbard. And he scored 10. There were 10 guys who had more rushing touchdowns than him. Every single one of those players had relatively high average draft positions, meaning we expected them to have at least a decent season. What would happen if one or two of those guys would have gotten hurt? Chances are we wouldn't see this same type of result. James Cook tied for the league lead with 16 rushing touchdowns this year. If he goes down in week 4 with an injury, do you think all of those touchdowns would have just gone to Ray Davis? If Derrick Henry gets hurt in week 9, do we think that one of the Ravens' backups is just going to score the same number of touchdowns as Derrick freaking Henry? What about Josh Jacobs? I mean, we know the answer to that. The Packers were splitting their RB2 spot all season long with Marshawn Lloyd injured. They would have had a split backfield, and a split backfield would have led to split touchdown totals. When running backs don't get injured, there's then a higher chance for stronger numbers by those individual running backs. It may not be seen as strongly at the league-wide level, but it will definitely be felt on the individual one. And top running backs in 2024, they didn't get injured at the same rate as top running backs in the past. But look, I can't ignore the fact that drafters were also just better this year. We did a good job collectively setting ADP. In fact, since 2014, depending on how you slice it, you could say that 2024 did the best job at accurately predicting running back finishes compared to any other year. The correlation between preseason expectation or ADP and actual result is really strong across the board. And to be honest, the way the market was behaving preseason made some of the concepts that we drafted by in the past a little bit more difficult this year. I wrote a newsletter back in August called "This Year's Running Back Dead Zone is Different," because running backs are being drafted later in 2024 than in previous seasons. In the late round draft guide, I wrote about how there were a lot of running backs in the traditional running back dead zone who had some traits that we would want them to have in order to emerge from that dead zone. In other words, there weren't as many traditional dead zone backs. And a lot of them did emerge. A huge reason we're seeing the numbers that we're seeing from running backs this year, if not the entire reason, is because of what happened in the pre-draft high-end RB2 range. The guys ranked as RB13 to RB18. Those players completely destroyed that same grouping from every other season since 2014. They averaged 16 PPR points per game. That was a full point higher than any other year during that time frame. 5 of the 6 players in that group scored 14 or more PPR points. 4 of them scored 16 or more PPR points. The market completely destroyed a chunk of the running back dead zone in 2024. That played a major role in the position being as good as it was. Because let's face it, had we gotten these exact same results, but from running backs drafted in round 10, round 11, round 12 only, we wouldn't be talking about this today. We'd be saying, yeah, running back was good this year, but there's no reason to draft them early and often because we can get them in round 10 and round 11. But that's not what happened. What happened was the top 18 running backs by ADP largely performed very, very, very well. But make no mistake, what we saw in 2024 shouldn't be considered the standard. I do think we may see teams across the league try to copy the success of others who lean more on their running backs this year. It's a copycat league after all. I do think we're going to continue seeing teams run the ball at the goal line because they think that they have a power advantage and because they have mobile quarterbacks to confuse defenses. I do think the market will be smarter than it was 10 years ago. That's going to elevate the backs we used to always target in round 8 or 9 while devaluing the obvious running backs to avoid, specifically in the dead zone. All of that makes me believe that the running back position may not fall all the way back in 2025. But considering how healthy the position stayed, considering the talent that we projected from the position entering the season, considering the obvious and massive shift that we saw in touchdown scoring, I would expect things to fall back to earth a bit next season. I'm not ready to call it a running back renaissance. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Remember, you can pre-order that prospect guide right now over on lateround.com. Go do that. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later in the week with the episode on all the stupid things that I did during the 2024 season. I'll talk to you then.